Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. I'm your host, Philip Eidson. Well, today I'm joined by my good friends Pierre Lapree and Jason Treida from Pear Angusta. Pierre actually founded Pear Angusta back in 2012 to solve the pains it was having as a director of procurement at Adecco in tracking and reporting the performance of his procurement team. And you may know Jason as the co-founder and COO of IASTA and then Chief Customer Officer of Determine following Determine's acquisition of IASTA. Well, today Jason is supporting the Pear Angusta team in their international growth. Well, this week's podcast is actually based on our recent AOP Live webinar with Pierre and Jason. So they joined us last month to take live audience questions about how procurement can maximize the value potential of automation while ensuring that performance management is not lost in the noise of technology. And if today's topic is of interest to you, I highly recommend that you download the accompanying ebook that the team at Pear Angusta created following the webinar. It's called Procurement Performance Management Defined, a best practice guide for a new decade. It includes a summary of all the questions and the answers from the webinar and from this podcast, as well as a getting started with Procurement Performance Management Guide. If you're interested in taking a look at that, you can download it at artofprocurement.com/ppm. That's artofprocurement.com/ppm. Okay then, well, let's go into the podcast. And given Jason's background as a procurement software entrepreneur, I actually started the conversation by asking him about procurement's approach to investment in technology.
So I feel procurement typically been behind the curve in investment, and now they're starting to catch up a little bit. And I think there's probably maybe three major influences for that. The first is over the last 10 years, there's a lot more access to industry information, like with webinars and conferences, podcasts, publications. And so now we can really really see what's out there and who's doing what and what change is happening. So it's a lot more accessible than it has been in the past. Right. And secondly, technology is rapidly changing. And so you're right, it is the shiny new things allowing procurement to be more strategic and transparent. And then I would say finally, that these technology companies are making major splashes with their massive amounts of investment. So they're taking over conferences and creating a big buzz out there. And so everybody obviously wants to see what's going on and who's doing what. And so that's something that I think has really changed over the last 10 years. And a lot of that can be very overwhelming with a large number of options and a lot of players out there and a lot of startups. So it's obviously we like to really encourage that everybody has a plan to evaluate what they really need and helping them make the right decision. I'm kind of curious, Pierre, what you think of that as well.
Yeah, and is that something you're seeing as well, Pierre? Especially like when you look at, it's interesting to see how much more investment is coming to the procurement space that wasn't necessarily there, as you say, Jason, a few years ago. And now there are folks outside of procurement, whether it's investors, VCs, or whatever, that are suddenly waking up and saying, hey, there's a lot of untapped value here because perhaps it's been an underserved community from a tech perspective.
Yeah, true. And I guess that the people realize, I remember when we were trying to advocate procurement to others, we always used to say, $1 saved is $1 that hits the bottom line. You have this direct take on companies' profitability. And when you talk to a lot of private equity firms, they're starting to pay attention because, that's how they secure their investment. And of course, this has driven a lot of attention from the private equity firm, and this trickles down to the venture capitalist firm who will now start investing in companies like ours, for sure. That has changed, definitely.
Now, and this may be kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm interested, you talk about $1 saved, and the impact that has on the bottom line. Do you think that's too short or too small of a perspective on what procurement is capable of doing? Or because we've kind of built our profession on that idea, but I'm not sure if it's kind of self-limiting at the same time.
Don't get me started on this one so early in the discussion, please. I would say it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one for sure. Right. So maybe we can take that on later in more deeper detail, in bigger details. But we have to deliver on that, but clearly we will stop existing if we only live by that mantra of €1 saved is €1 to the bottom line. So again, you have to do that. That's not sufficient. And that's clearly not the most satisfying aspect of the profession, although you can have some good good years of your life doing this, but ultimately when you want to grow, when you mature, you want something else.
Right. And do you see, Jason, how that's changed as your kind of involvement as in procurement has gone, like from perhaps back in the days when you started IASTA to where we are today, that there is a different kind of perspective on what the art of the possible is for procurement?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And just the solutions that are supporting that as well. So I think there's, when we started IASTA, it was all about ERFX and reverse auctions, and that was it. And all the competitors that we had out there, great solutions, but that was the primary focus. But it's not anymore. It's now specialized point solutions, and those are things that are new and innovative. So now you have just strategic sourcing solutions that focus just on print or services or commodities or public and private sector, and then also different negotiation styles. So dynamic bidding and allowing stakeholders to have more input and not focusing just on price. And there's cognitive sourcing solutions out there that are really helping to be predictive and prescriptive and not just reactive, using AI to find opportunities in your sourcing event. So just a wide range of companies out there. And what I really kind of, I guess, and also to that is, our solutions now very broad and deep in functionality, or are they very simple to use and really helping just for greater adoption. So I think every organization really needs to understand what are they trying to achieve? What problems do they have? How are we trying to solve this? And now I think you're starting to see organizations use multiple e-sourcing solutions even because they are so unique. So now they got to be point solutions. They got to integrate with each other. And how do we now manage our entire pipeline and savings with our unique solutions? And so that's, I think, a radical change of what we've seen in the market.
It seems like from a procurement leader perspective, you're now having to become an architect of all these different kind of offerings and how you best kind of map, design, blueprint, if you will, and have them all plugging into each other so that everything doesn't operate in a silo versus taking the easy option of, well, let's just go and buy a suite. But if you have the ability to do that, then you get a lot more power in the data that you're able to collect as all these systems talk to each other.
Completely agree. It makes a lot of sense. Yep.
And as Jason said, one major shift, and that's a technology shift, is that what used to be a real nightmare, getting two systems, two ERP system or MRP system to talk together, it's now just so simple. I mean, you have all these API, you have standards, you have plug and play integration with a lot of things. You get the notion of platform where solutions can talk to each other. And that's becoming really almost like a play of Lego, where you can add bricks to each other and provided the bumps and the holes are the same size, well, you can plug them together. And that's, I think, a game changer in procurement technology.
So I want to move that on to, you're talking a little bit about performance metrics. I know that's one of really the focuses of today's conversation is our metrics and performance measurements. How have you seen those evolve in a procurement organization as the maturity of a procurement group evolves? Because you may start at one very basic level as you're beginning a transformation journey, for example, or even pre-transformation, but then change those as you perhaps evolve the maturity of your group. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about what you've seen from that regard.
So clearly the way you measure performance and the way you consider performance is clearly a direct function of your maturity as a procurement organization. And when you look at various stages of a procurement organization, it's very funny because you can see that you start from a very transactional aspect and almost a guy in the purchasing department placing POs and collecting invoices. That's a very transactional aspect. And here the key performance metrics are really about process performance metrics and KPIs. And how long does it take me to flip a PO or to flip a purchase request into a PO? What's the cycle time? Very transactional and very focused on the process itself rather than the value of procurement. And then as you start growing, you become more structured, you become more strategic, you become more integrated within your organization or even within your value chain, your ecosystem with your supplier. And as you grow there, the metrics, the performance metric will grow with you, and they have to, because ultimately you need to adjust your messaging to the people you're talking to. So we're clearly seeing things that go from the basic, and no offense behind that, but basic transactional KPIs to more process-oriented stuff. Then we start measuring savings, and then when savings are no longer sufficient, then you start measuring things like value added, supplier collaboration, and stuff like that. And it's a journey. I mean, don't lure yourself in thinking that you can start doing supplier collaboration if you're a newly established procurement organization. There are steps you need to take, and that's the maturity curve of procurement.
Yeah, is there a danger of having too many metrics?
Sorry, come again?
Yeah, is there a danger of having too many metrics? So I think that's one of the things that we often have is we have this big dashboard and there's so many things we talk about and you kind of get lost in what's important.
Ultimately, we need to realize that there's no magic in technology, and the data has to come somewhere. And either you collect this automatically, and then you need to invest heavily in systems that can talk to each other and massage the data, or you need to input it manually because no system is behind that. But in all cases, the level of resources, the level of effort you have to deploy to get those things, well, you better need to think twice whether you want to show shiny dashboards to a stakeholder or if you simply want to have a conversation with them. And based on 2-3 KPIs, like something that matters to them. So clearly, too many KPIs can hurt the conversation.
All right. Well, I just want to take a quick pause just to encourage anybody who is watching. Again, if you have any questions for Pierre or Jason, please feel free just to add them into the, I'm looking at the dashboard right now. There is a questions button. There's also a chat opportunity as well if you want to chat directly with Kelly, and Kelly can jump in with the questions. We do have questions that we received in advance. Part of the AOP Live is we really encourage you to submit questions before we jump into the conversation so we can build those kind of into the narrative for the day. And one of the questions we got is from Gabriel, forgive me for not knowing which pronunciation that is. And the question was, how can we balance the cost savings initiatives that we talked about there and supplier relationship management and help upper management understand that even though something doesn't deliver hard savings, you know, it's still delivering value. In this case, it could be delivering cost avoidance, and that those are important when you look at the performance of procurement.
That's a very subject that or a question that's very close to my heart, and I can get into heated arguments on this one. I often say in a slightly provocative way, but I truly believe in that. A procurement function that doesn't deliver some economic value is useless. So we need to deliver that. And we usually look at cost savings or cost avoidance, and this sometimes look like a dirty word. But there are many ways of doing this. You not always have to twist your supplier's arm or smash their head to get some price reduction. You can have meaningful and constructive conversation that will take the cost or take the price down without hurting your supplier. And we need to have those. I mean, when I started as procurement practitioner a few years ago, the whole procurement organization was built on saving multi-million dollars on telco because the market was moving. And that's how we earned our stripes. That's how we get the business to talk to us. So you need to do that. And you need to establish this baseline of trust and credibility, and money is an excellent way of doing that. And you should do that in a way that the discussion on economic value of procurement is no longer a debate or a question. I mean, you're bringing money. When you announce a number, I can trust that number because we've worked on that together. So now let's focus on the more interesting conversation. But we said that a few minutes ago, you can't go to your board and say, hey, we're going to go all collaboration and innovation with our supplier and say, okay, who are you, by the way? Now, you do your job, and then you can claim that proverbial seat at the table and do some interesting stuff. So how can we, to go back to the question from Gabriel, the question is, how do we balance that? Well, you balance that by struggling a bit, showing your worth and showing your value in terms of economic performance, because there are countless studies from the Deloitte, the Capgemini, the PwC on CPO's top priority. Cost reduction is always number one, and very often by a large measure. So that's what I expect you for. Deliver that, and then they will pay attention to the more interesting thing, and that's where you will get a very attentive ear, and that's where you will make an additional level of difference. Take care of the bottom line, and then you can contribute to the top line, and there you will be a rock star procurement person, an enterprise hero.
I like to talk about the idea of procurement math as well. What's really important is that data, and I think you touched on it a moment ago, how trustworthy that data is, because one of the things that I think we've probably all done as practitioners is you are claiming savings that may be a little bit dicey in terms of how realistic they are, but perhaps the governance structure that you're working within gives you the opportunity to report them in that way and claim them in that way. So actually being those, having a mechanism in place to know that your CFO can know that they can trust that information is kind of foundational. And then you can start building upon that to say, okay, what are the other things that are important to my business? And I had a conversation with somebody who was in a fast-growing tech company in Silicon Valley. Cost savings wasn't really important to them, but what was really important was the fact that it cost them $500,000 a year to bring in a software engineer. And so they didn't want their software engineer on $500,000 a year spending time in the procurement process. And so they actually measured how much time that they saved from that software engineer, and software engineers like them, you do that at scale, measured how many hours they saved, and that was actually a really big contribution to the business, benefit to the business. So it's always kind of looking out of what's important to the business. How can you build a metric around it, but don't just rely on that as being your single measure. Like say, cost savings is here, and some companies may say they don't care about it. At the end of the day, they do, because they want to at least understand that investment is, at least cost neutral.
One thing to add to that as well. I had a conversation yesterday with an old colleague, and we were talking about just knowing who your audience is. So the stakeholders, you can have those discussions about value creation and cost avoidance, but when you're working with finance, they just care about the P&L, and you're having multiple spreadsheets that they're managing. So again, knowing your audience and what discussions you can have with those people.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've spent a lot of time building business cases as you look at the value of procurement, selling in the value of software in procurement. And you see kind of what the executive team will take as being, that's kind of a fair measure of value, versus what they look at and say, that's kind of based on paper and it's all very nice, but I don't really believe it.
Yeah, very often you need to make, and going back to the VCs and the private equities, these people, they often work with comparables. Okay, so hey, we want to value that company, how other companies have been valued in a similar sector, and they grow from that. And I think that procurement people, when they build the business case for technology investment, they should be doing the same. And look at other functions. Does anyone question finance when they need a financial system, a forecasting system? No. So should be the same with P2P. Do we question the head of sales when he wants to invest in a CRM to follow his pipeline of leads? No. So should we have that conversation for the sourcing pipeline? And this goes on and on and on. I mean, do we challenge HR when they want an applicant tracking system? No. So should we challenge an investment in supplier onboarding? I think that we should be using that, and I think that procurement could learn a lot from looking at how others are doing, because let's face it, procurement is a relatively young function. We're growing fast as a function, but sales and HR and finance has been here forever, and so they've fought those battles and they've earned the credibility to get investment. We need to be there, and so we maybe could learn a thing or two from our colleagues.
Yeah, I feel some of that is in the sales of procurement. It's because it's the same. It's not just for the software. It's, everything we're talking about today, the performance metrics, are really all to build a picture of value so that the C-suite looks and says, yes, I'm going to continue my investment in procurement versus all these other investment opportunities I have in the business, or I'm going to grow my investment in procurement. And, where you say if a HR comes and says, I need an applicant tracking system, it's a no-brainer. The only question is which one. It's same for financial forecasting, same for an ERP system. For procurement, not so much. And I think some of that is because we haven't necessarily solved the art of the possible for procurement. So there isn't a direct connection with investing in this technology, investing in these people is going to mean these outputs. And so there's more work to be done, certainly from that perspective.
And I would say that's why we need to sometimes go back to the basics. And the basics is, okay, what's my value proposition to the company? And value proposition is, okay, we need to put these contracts under control. We need to put that spend under control. We need to ensure that this supplier is delivering. And so you need a roadmap, basically, and you need to build that roadmap and demonstrate that roadmap. And then the rest are ways to make the process smoother and more effective, more efficient. But you need to sell your value to the people and say, hey, exactly as you said, this is the field of possibilities. Where do you want me to go? Right. Where should we put our effort? Where should we put our money? And that's an interesting thing, because I think, and circling back to the first the first question about we're always lured by the fancy, the shiny. We should not let go of the critical and core business issues of what we're doing. And technology is just a means to an end. You need technology, but you need to think first.
So I want to let Kelly jump in. I think Kelly has been waiting patiently on the line with a question that you have from the audience.
Yes, and the good thing is this question is absolutely worth waiting for. So it's a really interesting question that's come in from Wayne. And clearly the focus of our conversation today is figuring out how procurement performance metrics and management programs can support and enable procurement to grow and mature. And he's made an interesting observation that a growing amount of the spend that procurement is focused on bringing under management is actually highly skilled professional services. And so he's connecting the idea of supplier performance management and the traditional KPIs that typically go along with that, and the more strategic things that either procurement is trying to achieve or that companies are trying to achieve through their highly skilled professional services suppliers. How can we make sure that all of the performance metrics issues or performance management issues that we feel that we face and that are holding us back, that we don't make that exact same mistake when we turn around and try to manage the performance of our professional services suppliers?
That's actually an excellent question. I think that one of the first issues we should not reproduce, because we've done that for procurement performance, we've done that for contracts, we've done that for RFPs, is stop the spreadsheet madness. I mean, getting around with a supplier is not the same as sending a 100-line spreadsheet with various criteria and weighting and a lot of that. And we fail too often in that trap, where we try to reduce everything to scores in a spreadsheet. So you need a thread or a guide to define what you want to pay attention to, what's important for your business. But then you should use that as a way to have conversations. And so that should be a very limited number of metrics and a lot of more face-to-face conversation. And I mean, the power of writing is huge, and having a conversation and putting notes to the paper and putting that in perspective with actual scores and metrics, this goes a long way in assessing procurement performance. And of course, this is maybe not very scalable. If you have 10,000 suppliers, clearly you will not do that with 10,000 suppliers, but you possibly have 10, 20, 100 strategic suppliers. And with this number of suppliers, these practices, they scale. And there's a very famous guy in the venture capital world called Paul Graham. And his advice to the unicorns, the big startups, is start with things that don't scale. Mm-hmm. And you will see what works, you will see what doesn't work. It will be a bit more effort. and then you will be able to reduce what you're doing to the core, to the essence of what you're doing. And I guess that this is what you should be doing for supplier performance. 3, 5 metrics, but then a lot of face-to-face conversations with the business and suppliers. And little by little, you will arrive to a situation where the right metrics will become obvious.
Yeah, I would also encourage, just as a build on for that, is when you're thinking about the metrics you have with suppliers, don't ask for too much. And what I mean by that is, often when we're looking at scope of works, things are often overspecified because, in the direct side, material side of things, because they want the best material, they want, the best this, that, and the other, because it's just to reduce the risk that an engineer faces with buying something. Well, in professional services, having too strict metrics is just the same. We're over-specifying what it is that you want to buy, and therefore you're increasing the cost to serve on your provider. But you may be asking for things that aren't necessarily either generally reasonable or just kind of, they're not realistic. So we ask, for an example is at a call center. You may have a call center and you have a metric in there that says, I want somebody to pick up the phone in 3 rings. And actually, there's no difference in the experience of the customer if you pick up the phone in 5 rings. But by having it 3 rings versus 5 rings may mean that you need to increase the number of people who are on standby for your account by 20%. And that's a big impact on the cost to serve. So kind of balance what you really need versus, am I just asking a provider to do something because I think it protects the downside more, or protects me reputationally, or whatever it is. And I see that all the time.
And in my experience, actually, when you talk about supplier performance management, this shouldn't start when the contract is signed. This should start from the sourcing and tendering part. And that's exactly what you say, Phil. You need to listen to your suppliers or your prospective supplier, because they might save you a lot of money, they might save you a lot of headaches, and ultimately they will put themselves and they put yourself in a way of getting superior services and getting meaningful interaction. So the best way to pick to have the right suppliers is to pick them right, to listen, to relent a bit of control. I mean, sometimes it's hard for us in procurement sometimes to trust the suppliers, because they just want some money. Some want, some don't. So, and that's a hard balance to strike. And I believe procurement people will be good when they know when to trust the supplier, when they can also go back to the business and say, hey, I believe this guy is right. And maybe we should say that 5 rings is enough. That would be better for everyone. So, yeah.
Now, do you think that as we talk about maturing metrics, can procurement as a function mature if our metrics don't mature? Are those two things aligned with each other, or are we looking too deeply into what procurement metrics are?
So I guess that the answer is in the question. No, our function will not mature if our metrics don't. But I think somehow it's a chicken and a positive chicken and egg, and sometimes we need to change our metrics to show that our work has changed, and sometimes we need to be challenged by our company to say, hey, I'm no longer interested in this, please tell me what you do on that. And in order to capture those metrics, well, you need to change your ways, you need to change your system, you need to change a few things, and so I think it goes both ways. One of the examples I had from one of our clients is that they had a big issue with stakeholder engagement, and they used to track things like the stage of involvement from very early, where they could influence the need, down to the last level, where they basically receive a contract on their desk. And the problem was so big that they created an additional level saying no procurement involvement. And these people, they say, okay, we want to track that. They went through the hassle of registering things that they had no involvement in. They completely killed their savings numbers, or at least the average savings percentage, because there were so many things where they had 0% of savings that they were killing their numbers. Yet they used these new metrics to push their organization to change. And they showed to the CFO, say, hey, we have 20% of the project where there's no involvement. That's $10 million of spend. And we could have saved, like for the rest, 5%. Right. So 5% on that. Do we really believe as an organization that no procurement involvement is worth that amount of money and possibly that amount of risk and lost opportunity? And so they made their point, situation changed, they got rid of that metric because it was no longer meaningful or useful. So you will mature by using new metrics or by using temporary metrics. But sometimes finance will come to you and say, hey, we're strapped on cash, so can you start measuring improvement in payment terms? Say, oh, that's a thing? Initially, I used to take that as a negotiation chip because I didn't care about 30 days or 60 days. So right. Supplier, lower price, but bigger payment terms. And suddenly finance challenges me on that. Okay, so we need to change something. And again, we grew as a function, but this time because finance came to us with a new metric, and that helped us think more strategically, more. We took a side step and took finance's perspective on working capital, and that's how we grow. So clearly, it's a bit of both, but it's hopefully you can create an upward spiral and elevate the role of the function and the maturity.
Now, as we get access to more data through new technology that we're able to invest in, and perhaps cleaner, better data, as we realize that data is actually important rather than just something to complain to accounts payable about that it's not right. As we invest more of our time in that, is that going to change I think the way to frame the question, is it going to change one, I think, how we measure and report procurement value? But the second question really, is it going to enable new insights so we can actually do things differently than we did today, or perhaps change behaviors within the organization that we couldn't until today because we just didn't have the data that led to those insights?
Yeah, one of the things that Pierre and I teamed up and we started working on is just the data that we're able to collect. And so if we can look at maybe the different stages of the sourcing cycle process, how long does it take to run an activity, and looking at that by the different business units. So when we can see maybe we're generating a very low savings of 5,000 or less in savings by our negotiations for a certain stakeholder, but the project is taking an extremely long time compared to all the other negotiations. And so we can really start driving into and digging into seeing, all right, well, what phase of the negotiation maybe is taking too long? Where are roadblocks at? Maybe meet with the stakeholders and see how we can reduce barriers so we can be more efficient as a team. And so as we do collect more data, I think there's a lot of insights we can get from procurement performance management and looking into, again, just trying to be more efficient as a team since we don't have the resources that we need.
And this can go very far because, it's like an onion. You can peel the onion and find different layers of insights, and you can start with the procurement practices, like Jason said. We have clients who presented them with a graph saying, hey, you address 10% of your spend in the travel category doing e-auction. But for professional services, it's 80%. Is that right? Honestly, I don't know. And maybe it's right, maybe it's not. But at least you can take a step back and say, that's what we're doing. In reality, it's not what we expect to do or what we strive to do, but that's what is that right or not? And do we need to change that? We could envision things where you can start benchmarking with your peers on these kind of things. But the more interesting thing, I believe, is when you start doing this with your stakeholders. Say, hey, Mr. Marketing, we're doing 3 projects with you this year. We've been doing 50 with IT. How come? And the funnier discussion is when you do that in front of the CEO. Oh yeah, how come? And these are insights that will make your life a lot easier because you, as procurement practitioner, we know we need to be involved. We need to do proper process. We need to be involved upfront. But sometimes, people believe you're a die guy because, you do that because you want to feel important. Those insights, those data we collect, they will help you prove your point with hard facts hard data, and no one can argue with that. And that's I think the biggest promise for me of technology is stop being an intuition or feelings-based conversation between procurement and the rest of the world to a fact-based, data-based conversation, and that will change everything.
Yeah, using data to, I just kind of jotted down as you're talking there, using data to change or modify behaviors. That's as opposed to just focusing it on, I've got more data so I can be 5% more effective in a negotiation. It's actually how do we help the organization change their behavior? Yeah.
And that's extremely powerful, these nudges of behaviors that, I mean, procurement is a function, we're a people function. A lot of people see us as process and analytics, but we're in a business of relationship. And so we need to also learn how we can influence the behavior of people. And sometimes data is a good ally for that.
Yeah. So just I'll jump in. Just another reminder: if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat box or ask them in the question field on the GoToWebinar control panel. As I go into the next kind of question, it's interesting we just talked about behaviors. When we talked and did preparation for today's session, we talked a lot about rituals, and procurement rituals that we see that you kind of think, why are we still doing that? Maybe things that we assume as being the way to do things because we don't challenge our assumptions. You obviously get to see, when you speak to a lot of prospects and clients, rituals that you're helping them to overcome. So what are some of those rituals that you see consistently that, you're kind of helping folks to break through so that they can perhaps have, elevate the role of procurement, have a different outcome with their stakeholders?
The first example that comes to my mind is, again, I'm going to be slightly provocative, but the control freaks. We have one big client. They used to have 6 different validations from the identification of a project through the completion and the reporting of the same 6 times. And out of the 6, 3 things validated exactly the same thing at 3 different ways. There was no value. And I mean, procurement people are smart people, they are educated people, and they can make decisions. So instead of framing them into a very rigid process, a very rigid control framework, well, trust them, let them use their brain, and this will do marvels. And sometimes it's hard because of, you believe that workflows will give you compliance and will give you security and a lot of things. They don't. I mean, everybody is bored with that and has better things to do than clicking buttons. So one of the rituals we help them a lot breaking is exactly that. Is, okay, how can we go from 6 validation steps to only 2? Do we do this project? Do we agree on the mandate and the baseline? And what's the result in the end? And that's enough. And in the middle, let the people talk. If they don't agree or if they have questions, they will talk, and they prefer that. So these rituals that, for me, it's organizational scar tissues in large enterprise. It's okay, yeah, we need to go through steps A, B, C, D, E. C and D are not necessary. Well, too bad, go through them. That's fine when you're committing spend to external parties. When you're talking about procurement performance, there's no impact on your client, on your margin, on your image. So it's internal stuff. Have a conversation. That's better.
Just creating a lot of bureaucracy, kind of pointless bureaucracy.
Yeah, and it's also just creating new rituals, as Pierre mentioned, but just starting with some new ideas. So instead of letting all the stakeholders come to procurement, asking for updates on their projects and where we at and what's the next stage, it's also then starting to be a lot more proactive and creating that ritual of updating them and having the weekly or every other week meetings with the stakeholders, reviewing the information, what roadblocks may be ahead, getting their feedback on what's maybe changed on their end of the business as well. So it's just being very transparent and collaborative, and those are great rituals to get started.
Yeah, it's like, I think governance is really important, but we can overdo it. So that's where I see, when we work with a lot of procurement transformations, there's either no governance or there's too much. And so you're either getting involved in everything and people think that you're just procurement's the policeman and they're just kicking me when I do something I shouldn't do, or they try to create all these roadblocks for me to jump over, or it's kind of the Wild West and everybody's doing what they want. So it is a fine line. Pierre, you said like something at the beginning, something at the end. That's something that we've always advocated as well is, you want upfront, for example, in a sourcing project, everyone to be on the same page, to agree on the strategy, to agree on the way that value is measured and the way that value is going to be measured. So you're not all arguing about it at the end. And then you come back at the end to say what happened. This is the sourcing award. This is the value that we've actually been able to achieve. Get everybody to sign off on it. You don't need, as you said, Pierre, all the stuff in all the gates and the stages that you sometimes have in the middle. So long as you have something at the beginning, something at the end.
And that sometimes, I didn't really think about that this way when we prepare, but there's maybe a balance between governance and rituals. Mm-hmm. And governance is something that is imposed by the organization because we need to do things in a certain way, and that's the validation. But the rituals is somehow the informal governance. It's right. Okay. How do we ensure that once we've agreed on the baseline and the ambition, and before we move on to the end result, how do we ensure that in the middle we speak often enough, and we speak with the right level of people to ensure that we're following the course, and that's possibly the hardest but the most interesting thing, because it's a people thing. You need to talk to people, and you need to have people with sometimes slightly disaligned interest or concern, the stakeholder and procurement. Well, you need to build those rituals, and you need to build the trust. And again, going back to the initial discussion on how do we elevate the role of procurement, that's how you do that. It's by talking to people. They will realize that you actually bring a lot of value. That, it's interesting to work with you, and next time they will come again. So you need to have those rituals in place. You need to establish them, and that's tricky, but it's good.
So I got a kind of question as we think about, we have a few minutes left here. I want to talk a little bit about actions that people can take away from the conversation. I think maybe something that you've already answered, so you could just kind of reiterate. It may be something else that comes to your mind. But one of the questions that we had in advance was from Himaka, who asked, what's one habit that we can actually implement in our kind of daily procurement lives to be more productive? Maybe it's in the context of the rituals we talked about. Maybe it's something else that we haven't touched on today, but how can we start making that change?
That's an interesting one. I guess that one of the expression I learned from an American colleague is walking the talk. And I think that this is critical in procurement. I mean, so you need to start outlining your roadmap, and you should build this with the stakeholders and with finance. You should keep them updated, and you should explain them what are the results you're measuring. And so that's not something that you will be doing tomorrow, because it takes time. But the key thing is, whatever you do, make it visible, make it transparent, and make it indisputable. Whenever you announce savings to finance, well, if they challenge you, you need to be straight in your shoes and be able to claim that and say, oh, well, no, you're right. We should not report that as saving. You're dead. If you act like that, you're dead. You should fight. So the single one, the single biggest thing you need to make is getting more structure and more transparency into whatever you're doing. And there are many ways of doing that, but it starts from you and possibly your manager. This should not come from the head of finance or the head of procurement. You're a professional. You need to work in a very strict manner and make that visible.
Jason, I don't know if you had anything to any thoughts as well, or anything to add on actions that folks can take.
Yeah, I mean, what Pierre said is spot on. The only thing is just making sure you have the clear end goal. What are we trying to achieve? Working with the stakeholders to do that. So what is the value? Is it just the price? Is it the value we're creating? And just the communication, being very available, I guess, and making sure that we're updating everybody when they need to be updated, and not overwhelming them with information, but just, again, just figuring out the best way to be transparent and communicate with the business unit.
Okay, so I guess before I just check in again with Kelly, I have a final question. This is Jason for you. And that's, you obviously have that procurement technology background. We talked a lot about the intersection of technology and performance, and managing and monitoring performance in procurement. How would you advise folks to really think about what they should be looking at from a procurement technology perspective? Where to even start? You said at the beginning, you talked about all the different kind of technologies that are out there that procurement leaders can consider, and sometimes it feels like it's a little bit like being hit by a bus. You have one of those maps that has all the different categories, and now there's 50 logos in each one of them, thinking, where do I even start? What kind of recommendations do you give to folks who, as they're thinking about where to start in their investment in procurement tech?
Yeah, I think I've said it multiple times, but just understanding the end goal, what we're trying to achieve. So we've seen people that send out these massive RFPs that have 1,000 questions and all the features and functionality that you might have. But again, is that what the business really needs? Is that what they're going to use? Are you overcomplicating a system, and then nobody's going to use it? So it's just, what is it that we're really trying to achieve? And again, if you don't have that roadmap and you don't have the strategic plan of the procurement team, you don't know. So maybe it's not the right time to go out and look for solutions. So once you do feel like you have that, then it's very easy now to go to trade shows, webinars, and look at what solutions are out there. And before you just go out and you build your RFP, is just trying to see what's out in the market, talk to peers, and just get some ideas out there. I think that will really kind of help start guiding you into what solution that would make the most sense, because there are a ton of solutions out there now.
Right. Pierre, I saw you nodding your head there. I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. The world of technology has changed, and so now it's a lot easier than before to somehow try before you buy. So trust the supplier and ask them to show you, and come with them, not with a list of requirements like 400 lines in an Excel file, but rather with business case. Okay, that's what we're doing. Would you do differently? And how would that work into your solution? And if you have an open mind on how the supplier can challenge you, and if you believe in what they're showing you, well, first, if they can actually show you something that's tailored to your need, it means that they have been able to build that in a way that's manageable during the pre-sale thing. And so the odds that it will work during the actual project phase are quite high. So give it a shot. I mean, it's much better to dedicate a week to workshops with 2-3 vendors and going in the guts of the solution, rather than letting them 2 weeks to fill in ugly Excel file that will be wrong in the end, because they will say yes everywhere, and once you've signed and you're down to the knees in the mud, they said yes and it was no. Too bad.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say there. I recall a podcast that I had maybe a couple of months ago with a CPO of a huge telecom company here in the States, and he'd been really successful in building this ability for the team to move quickly and to try new things, piloting with emerging software providers, for example, in the procurement space, to see what the art of the possible was. Don't necessarily look at it as you have to take a decision on a technology and it's going to take you 6 months to implement, and you're not going to show what the value is for 6 months, and then you're already out $1 million. Technology doesn't work like that anymore. So small scale pilots, look at and empower, certain members of your team to have responsibility for doing that, then really helps you kind of figure out how you can connect all of these dots.
And this makes me think of, you asked me about one thing people could change to become more effective, and one of that is stop using a cookie cutter approach. I mean, we've been taught and trained to think of technology selection in a way with big RFPs and requirements, but sometimes it doesn't work. When you do that for an e-procurement solution, well, maybe that's the right thing, but for more agile point solution, you need to try. And you need to be able to take that step back and say, okay, do I need to do all that? Yes or no? Okay, how long should it take? What's the biggest requirement? And one of my American colleagues once told me that sometimes time is the biggest requirement. And yeah, you need to forego a few things just to make sure that you're not taking too many risks. But time is of the essence, and you need to go quick. And yeah, the process, you'll think about them another time. It's hard because you need to think yourself about, is it the right thing to do? And you sometimes need to convince your organization that, yeah, sometimes a competition is not needed, or we probably need to think differently about selecting new tech or new suppliers, because that would make more sense. So, yeah.
All right, well, before we go, I just want to hand over to Kelly one last time just to see if you had any other questions, Kelly, that came in from the audience.
We did, actually. And so this question from Stephen, I can't tell his exact persuasion from the way he asked the question. He's either very excited about or very concerned about our future robot overlords. So he's wondering if the expanded use of machine learning in business analysis and in monitoring processes and activities, if we should expect that greater automation will bring obviously greater data, but will also change the way we manage procurement performance, or if it's still largely going to be something where we're sort of tracking separately from our activity, what is our impact, what is our progress, how have we made a difference, versus having the technology used capture all of that activity itself.
I like that question, and again, it touches on a few things we've discussed earlier. And so obviously I didn't know about that question when I said that buyers should be using their brain, because that robots won't be able to do that. And actually, I think it's an excellent wake-up call that if you as a procurement organization are focused on low value-added tasks, on mundane or transactional things, well, you will get replaced by robots, that's for sure. A month and a half ago, there was this digital procurement world event in Amsterdam, and there was a startup that explained how they automate the bidding process and almost make decisions automatically on complex bids. I mean, if the only thing you know how to do is that, well, yeah, maybe the future doesn't look so bright for you. But if you've put that behind you because you've shown you knew how to do that, and you also show that there are better ways or other ways of doing, then you will still remain relevant. And actually, the robots and machine learning will make your life easier, because they will get you rid of the not so funny things, so that you can focus on the right thing. So I think it's now really the time to act for procurement and make sure that they protect their job going forward, and actually make their life easier, because otherwise the machines take over. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a space for it, and it's still very new, I guess. So I think everybody's still trying to figure that out. But if you have to have the human involvement and making sure you have good data. If you don't have good data, the AI is not going to be able to accomplish anything. So I think it's still kind of a learning process at this point.
Yeah, and the thing that I would add to that is, what you think about being strategic today might not be what's strategic tomorrow. So we spend a lot of time thinking, and it's a good example where Pierre talked about the startup who is doing a lot of really complex bidding. Back in the day, we'd think that was really high complexity strategic work for procurement. So like, look at us, we're spending all this time analyzing 500 different lanes for a big logistics event. Now that can all be done in technology. So don't focus on what's strategic today, focus on what we believe is strategic in the role of procurement in the future, and build ourselves up today so we have that opportunity to take that role, versus us being told, in a few years' time, hey, there's some technology that's going to replace all that stuff you thought was strategic but isn't anymore. We know we need to get ahead of ourselves, so it's us that's driving that conversation, as opposed to somebody from the outside coming in saying, hey, look at this new wonderful tech I've found, procurement, you're fired. And I think that's really, I don't necessarily want to end on a somber note like that. I think it's actually a really great opportunity for us to redefine what procurement is, and how we then look at procurement performance and measure it, as we've been talking about today, evolves. We talked about the maturity question, because yes, we'll always have that core requirement on savings, but there's so many other things that we're going to be evolving our profession into that we haven't yet figured out how to track. That's where we need to be thinking about so that people see the value beyond things that ultimately may be automatable. So with all that being said, we're at the last minute. So I just want to wrap up by thanking you, Pierre, and thanking you, Jason, for participating in the AOP Live session with us today.
Thank you.
And everybody, thank you for listening and for joining us, for watching us. We'll be pulling together the questions that were asked today, also questions that we got in advance that we just didn't have the opportunity to ask today. We'll get Jason and Pierre's answers on those, and we'll put all those into a short 1-2-page PDF, and we'll make sure that everybody who is on the call today gets that as soon as it's ready. So thanks again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or your evening, wherever you are in the world. So take care, everybody. Hi there, and thanks for joining us again today on the Art of Procurement. So as a reminder, if today's conversation was of interest to you, I highly recommend that you download the accompanying ebook that we created following the webinar. It's called Procurement Performance Management Defined, a Best Practice Guide for a New Decade, and it includes a summary of the questions and the answers from today's pod, as well as a Getting Started with Procurement Performance Management Guide. You can download that at artofprocurement.com/ppm. That's artofprocurement.com/ppm.